Hey, how you doing? This is RJ. So today I'm going to talk about why modern entertainment produces such awful characters. How the quote unquote progressive mindset is really the origin of this, and conversely, how to build good character both within your life and on the page. And of course, how to translate that good character into the ultimate form of a good character, which is a hero. But before we get there, I just want to let everyone know that there are two links in the description and on the pinned comment. They are links for my graphic novels. My current graphic novel is Crom the Destroyer. That campaign has about 12 days left in it. It's a return to form for low fantasy, a story about sacrifice, death, and honor. There's also a link for my second superhero graphic novel, The Valiant Heroes, and if you order anything from that campaign when you check out, you can also order my first superhero graphic novel, Thomas Valiant, as well. That's my exploration, more in depth of really a traditional form of a superhero. Also, a quick note to one of my listeners and one of my backers who goes by the name of Doctor Who, first name Thomas, if that's you, who has been emailing me for over a year now and getting more and more upset with me with every email because I don't respond. I have responded to every email you have sent me that I have received. Every comment that you have posted, I have replied to. Your book is in the mail, and you should really check your trash folder or your spam folder or your blocked folder or something on your email to see my responses. Or try to get a hold of me some other way, like on Twitter, and my Twitter handle is in the description as well. It's RJ of the Island if anyone wants to follow me over there. Anyway, as usual, before I get into the main meat of my topic, before talking about really character building, I want to talk about general things within entertainment and how they show a destruction of character. And for this, I don't think we can overstate the importance of the internet and how it plays into this entire thing. How much media we now have access to, and at the same time, how much of the lives of actors and actresses we also have access to. A lot of that plays into this entire thing. Because if you're an older fella like me, if you remember media back in the 80s or earlier, you recognize that it's nothing like we have today because you took what you could get, and that was very, very small as compared to what you have access to today. And on that note, what I've been doing recently is doing some, I would say, research really in both the, I would say, cyberpunk genre and things that are attached semi adjacent to that kind of idea. Some of the newer stories that I'm writing right now, which will be in future graphic novels, are based upon a villain group which has a very cyberpunk, not only aesthetic, but also mindset in how they operate. And I wanted to go back to all of that media that I missed because, again, you didn't have access to this media, certainly when it started back in the 80s, and all that media that I've missed since then because there's just so much available. And this is everything from going through synopses of cyberpunk novels that I never got to read, to listening to synth pop from back in the 80s and all the way up until its current iterations, watching cyberpunk B movies that I missed, or foreign movies and anime which lean into that genre. Just as when I was writing Crom the Destroyer, I was listening to the Conan the Barbarian soundtrack over and over again and listening to Robert E. Howard stories. Right now, I'm listening to the Escape from New York soundtrack over and over again and putting bad cyberpunk anime from the 80s up in the background. Anyway, I wanted a wide range because A, these villain characters originate from the Far East, and they deal with two different characters within my universe. One would be Pulse, who was introduced in The Valiant Heroes and Thomas Valiant. The other is Artemis, and she is going to be introduced in the backup story for The Valiant Heroes. But anyway, one of them, Pulse, is a very old character. He's been around in the universe for a long time. The other one, Artemis, is a very young character, a teenager. So again, wanted to get a whole spectrum of all of this. But here's the thing. In doing all of that research, I came upon this kind of realization about this subgenre, and I'm sure it probably works within other genres as well. When you see the beginning of this genre, and we're talking about it whether or not it's back in the 80s for different versions of it within Western entertainment, or the same with Eastern entertainment, again, being punctuated with different kinds at different times. But anyways, you'll see that it starts off in a very rough place, but to some extent, it's very genuine. But as it develops and starts to get more and more popular, you can see that it starts to improve technically over and over again, but at the same time, it becomes less and less genuine to the point where you see in some of these types of media right now an expression where it's almost a faux version of itself. It's a facade of what it used to be, wherein you get all of these characters or actors or groups, and they're portrayed in a way constantly and almost completely wherein they have attitude and they're bad. When A, they've done nothing to prove that, and B, usually just by looking at them, you can tell, especially if they're actors, yeah, that's not the case. Most of these people you could probably knock over with a strong wind. And while I'll admit that the earlier stuff had this in it as well, it only had it in as a part of a bigger whole, wherein you saw, again, characters or actors or groups revealing their vulnerability to some extent, and to show you that, yeah, this is an act, we understand, but it's a part of us, just like these other things that we portray, like weakness to some extent, that's a part of us as well, all this kind of thing. So it became a part of a whole, and that makes it easier for you as part of the audience to see them as a whole person or a whole character, and so helps you enjoy that entertainment more, really, because that suspension of disbelief is something that isn't that difficult. Now let's look at the opposite end of the spectrum from this. And I'm going to do that by recalling an interview I once saw with Samuel L. Jackson. It's fairly old now. He was doing it a few years after he started playing Nick Fury. But that interview always stuck in my head. Why? Because he said in the interview that whenever he meets fans who come up to him and talk to him like he was one of the characters that he portrays, he gets very upset. When people come up to him and think that he's the guy from Pulp Fiction or that he's supposed to act like Nick Fury, he gets upset because, as he said, I'm not Nick Fury, I'm Samuel L. Jackson. When you come up and talk to me, even though you're a fan, you're going to get Samuel L. Jackson. And to some extent, I can understand where he's coming from and his frustration and why he wants to be genuine in this way. But at the same time, if you're an actor, and most of the actors right now that you can see, especially within public, you can understand that, hey, guess what? You want people to know who you actually are as a person, but as a person, you're mean and nasty. As a person, you'll sell your soul for a handful of silver. As a person, you would be willing to destroy my entire life, small though it may be, because I don't ascribe to your political beliefs. And I'm sorry, but there's a couple of problems with that. Number one, personally for me, even if I was someone who could really and truly separate the art from the artist, because I find it really hard to do so, but even in those times when I try to do so, I just can't do it completely. There's always something that comes up which makes me look at, let's say, an actor. I look at you and go, oh yeah, he's the guy who said this. It could be anything. It could be an inflection of the voice. It could be the way that they stand. It could be a line that they say. It just brings me out completely of the story. And again, that suspension of disbelief is then destroyed. And I don't then actually engross myself in the story. I analyze it as a piece of media and go, here's the problem with it, here, 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 and here. I don't like it. And that's just the A part of it. The B part of it is much worse. It's the fact that the people creating this media right now are purposefully putting things into their entertainment that will, again, purposefully poke you right in the eye and let you know that, hey, you got to take yourself out of the story right here. Remember what this actor or this director actually wants you to think about right now, which isn't the story. And again, that takes you completely out of the story, and you don't. Anyways, for me, I don't enjoy it as a piece of entertainment. I analyze it as a piece of media. And then, again, I just pick out all the faults because every piece of media has faults, and then all I do is concentrate on the faults. But what's the connection between those two things that I just talked about? The types of media that, on the one hand, is so false, and on the other hand, is so, and we put this in quotation marks, so genuine with what the people have to say, that it breaks your suspension of disbelief, takes you out of the story, and makes it simply unenjoyable. Well, the connection is bad character. Or bad characters, one or the other. Or to put it another way, both of those types of media are shallow. Now, before moving on to the third type of media I want to talk about, I just want to go over for a second where I think this entire thing comes from. It comes from the fact that the quote unquote progressive political mindset that has captured the Western civilization right now is trying to change the culture, as I have said many times in the past, from a guilt culture to a shame culture, which we haven't had in the West since, at least 2,000 years now. The difference being a guilt culture is one where you internalize the rules, which are basically built upon truth. And when something goes wrong, you point your finger at yourself. Whereas shame culture is much more rules based upon other societal rules. And when something goes wrong, other people point the finger at you, or you point the finger at other people. And the problem is that a shame culture has these layers and layers of falsity built upon it because they're built upon social structure upon social structure upon social structure. And again, it is quote unquote progressivism that has brought this back into the West. But if you look at Eastern entertainment and the Eastern countries that it came from, they've always been shame culture. There's always been this false face that you've had to put on. To me, as a North American, because I've moved back and forth at various times over the countries of North America, first, I'm an introvert, and therefore social pomp and circumstance is something that just drains me, so I don't deal with it very well, and to some extent just try to avoid it. On the other hand, I'm very much ensconced in an American spirit where I would much rather deal with someone who is rude and genuine than a person who's being polite and two-faced. This is why I think I could never actually go as a tourist to any one of the Far Eastern countries. There's just too much layer upon layer of social etiquette that you need to follow. And I understand there are some social etiquette things which, to me, they have to be based upon something real, genuine, true, that you have to deal with. But those are the exception to the rule of life. They're not the rule of life. Not as a North American, anyways. And for a North American, the way out of this catch-22 of A, not really following social etiquette very well, but at the same time not showing everyone around you that you're a complete jackass, is quite simple. Just be a genuinely good person. And that's something that only works in a guilt culture. It doesn't work in a shame culture. You can see the quote-unquote progressive people. They'll destroy your life for some offhand comment that you've made, no matter how much of a good person that you are, how many good things that you do. And it appears to me to be the same within Eastern cultures. It doesn't matter how much of a good person you are. If you don't follow that social etiquette to a T, you slide down the ladder of how you're going to be perceived by everyone in the entire hierarchy. Whereas in a guilt culture, it's not like that. Even the precursors to Western guilt culture go back to the ancient Athenians, and you see the strains of this beginning to be pulled out in statements like the one from Pericles, where he talks about how service to your countrymen covers over a multitude of faults. Things like that. All right, so I want to talk about one more kind of media and one more thing to tie this all together. I'm going to talk for a minute about the comic book industry. There's been this growing idea since, at the very least, the mid-1980s, at the very least, of moving away from what a traditional hero is and moving away from just the superhero genre in general. I can remember an interview with the fellow who did that comic, what was it, Mouse? I can't remember the exact name of it. It's about mice and cats, basically portraying Germany within World War II, because the guy's grandparents were Jewish, all this kinds of thing. But anyway, he did an interview back in 1986 when he was talking about he wanted to do this kind of comic instead of just the normal superhero thing, because he said those superhero things, they're not real. And his proof of that was, how many times does a normal person get in a fist fight in their life? But to me, he was missing the entire point of why you have superhero comics and why they turn out the way that they do. And again, this grew and grew right up until what we have today. There was an interview I covered about 3 years ago between Ann Nocenti and Sana Amanat. Ann Nocenti was one of the great Marvel writers within the 1980s. Now, she's fairly progressive, but she's more of a second wave feminist than a third wave feminist. And then you had Sana Amanat, the person at that time who was second in control of Marvel Comics, the person who was vice president of content and character development. And the conversation between these two was very telling. First of all, Innocenti said, well, there are differences between men and women. And the thing about women is we don't take to violence and conflict the way that men do. And I had to, as a person writing superhero comics, I had to learn that. Whereas to guys, it sort of comes naturally. And she was explaining that because she said, that's the thing about superhero comics. It always comes down to a fight. And then Sana Amanat, trying to be very polite, basically said to her, well, you're wrong on that. And that's certainly not the way that we make comics today. Yeah, sure, there might be a little bit of conflict or a fight here and there, but that's not the central heart of what has to happen within a superhero comic book. It's got to be about friendship. It's got to be about sympathy or empathy for others. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, if you want to write those stories, you go ahead and write those stories with something else. That's not a superhero comic. And I agree with Ann Nocenti. Yes, it always comes down to a fight. But what's the point of that fight? Why is it there? Well, it's there because you have these characters who are embodiments of good and evil. And you have a conflict between good and evil. And you have a hero who stands up against evil. And that hero is a hero because he's virtuous. That's the traditional definition of a hero for thousands of years in Western civilization. And one of those key virtues is fortitude. And where does fortitude come from? Well, fortitude comes from suffering the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune within this life. And what happens within Western civilization, anyways, according to our own literature, what happens when you suffer those slings and arrows? Well, it builds good character. And that's really the key of why all of those fights are there. That's why it always comes down to a fight. Because either A, you're showing the stalwart fortitude of that character in building himself up to be the hero that you want him to be, or, I should say, or, he's using that fortitude that he's already built up in order to defend what is right. And to put it another way, it's that these characters are built upon pathos. And that idea of pathos goes right back, at the very least, to the ancient Greeks. And while some of those very early ancient Greek stories were only codified or even written down somewhere around the 800s BC, they occurred somewhere around the 1200s BC. So you're looking at this idea of pathos as far back within Western civilization as, at the very least, 3,000 years ago. Pathos as a Greek idea being that you suffer, and with that suffering, you build that fortitude, that virtue of fortitude that you need to be heroic. And this goes straight on into the Christian idea as well, to paraphrase that passage which says, glory in your suffering, because suffering builds perseverance. Perseverance builds character. And in another interview that Sana Amanat did, when she was talking about her co-creation of Kamala Khan, Miss Marvel, she came right out and said that, yeah, this character was built without pathos. That was specifically done. We did not put that tragic backstory in there like the older superheroes, because that's the way the new heroes are created. And again, we're listening to the woman who was the vice president of content and character development for over 10 years within Marvel Comics. You build characters, according to her, and her, the director of character development, without pathos, without that suffering, and if you do so, without character. And so what do you get? You get older characters who are just playing off of their very old stories to try to still prove that they're heroes, because at one point they went through all of this, although we're going to at the same time retcon and downplay that pathos as much as possible. They play upon that faux history that they don't even want to acknowledge. They create a new character that is a facade of the old character and simply put the character constantly in what appears to be cool-looking poses to prove that they're someone with attitude, a bad character that you have to watch out for. And why do they do this? Well, it's because in your quote-unquote progressive ideology and the quote-unquote progressive utopia that they're trying to build, there is no suffering. You want to get rid of suffering as much as possible. That's what their entire ideology tries to set up, again, as their utopia, as their endpoint, no suffering. And I don't think it's any coincidence that, once again, if you look at Eastern cultures, what you see as the main strain of philosophy, which expresses itself as religion, it's the idea of getting rid of all pain whatsoever. But as I said, this destroys character and certainly destroys heroism. And that's what I want to do for a second. Show you how this destroys character by showing you how it destroys the ultimate form of a character, which is a hero. As I said, the traditional form of a hero within Western civilization is a paragon of virtue. Those four virtues, which are central to this entire thing, are prudence, justice, fortitude, and temperance. And it is fortitude that I am here concentrating on. Again, if you listen to the strains of Western civilization and the thinking thereof, you can't have fortitude. You can't be brave unless you're vulnerable. Someone who is invulnerable has no reason to be brave at all. I actually created a character like this within Thomas Valiant #1. One of the central villains is Thor. This, by the way, is the same Thor character that you get in the Rampaging Thor, which you can get with the Valiant Heroes campaign. And my thought process behind this character was, if you're someone who is pretty much invulnerable and cannot be killed, and at the same time you're someone who is used to pain, like someone from a Norse culture would be, then what's the point of fighting against a foe? There's none really. And all he does within the book is he allows his foes to pound on him as much as possible so that they exhaust themselves, and then once they're exhausted, he can just sweep them away with the back of his hand. Because that's the point. If you're invulnerable and you don't mind pain, then what's the point of even putting any effort into it? Within that world, people mistakenly assume he's a hero because he does these things, but he's not. Again, that's the whole point. Being invulnerable means there's no reason to act, and there's certainly no reason why you need to be brave. Being brave only comes from a place where you are first vulnerable. And here we have the first step of that destruction within your quote-unquote progressive society of the idea of a hero, because they want everyone to be invulnerable. That's part and parcel of this shame culture. You never have to apologize for anything you do because you've never done anything wrong. You never point the finger at yourself. If something wrong happens, it's someone else's fault. You're always good as you are. Never admit to any kind of vulnerability. In their minds, that would lead to oppression of one kind or another. But within your traditional Western civilization, built upon guilt culture, it's completely the opposite. First of all, it's a realization that there is something bigger than you. This is part and parcel of the whole, I need to internalize these rules onto myself. It's not create these rules onto myself, do it just for me. It's internalize something that is bigger than me. Whereas, again, within your quote-unquote progressive society, you, as the individual, are the standard of all good and evil. Therefore, you can wipe the board clean every time you encounter something that might be a little bit harmful or painful to you and say, no, it's your fault. And one of those realizations within guilt culture and the fact that you are a small part of this larger whole is to understand that, yeah, first of all, there's evil in the world. And yeah, guess what? As a human being, doesn't matter as an individual or as a society or as the entire human race, you're not going to be able to defeat it. It is stronger than you, always stronger than you, which means whenever you go up against it, you have to be prepared at every turn to die. Not just to suffer pain, but to die. Now, you might just suffer pain. It might not be a killing blow, but you have to be ready for every blow to land as if it was something that was going to end your life. Because really, if all you're doing is, I can endure this pain up until a point, but I'm not going to put my life on the line for this thing, then what's the greatest good there? Well, you're determining that the greatest good is you. You must be preserved at all costs. But if you're ready to put your life on the line and say, yeah, I'm going to defend what needs to be defended, even if it means that I must die or could die in the process, then yeah, that's where bravery comes in. That's where fortitude actually works. And you don't throw your life away. Obviously, if you've gotten to a point of having the virtue of fortitude, you must first have the virtue of prudence, which means you make good decisions, which means if you're fighting an embodiment of evil, then yeah, you're gonna make better decisions than them. because you're prudent, so there's a chance that you can outsmart this person, outwit this person, defeat it without dying. But the point is that you have to be ready with every blow to be prepared to die. To say that what is good and true is more important than your life. To set yourself between what is right, what is true, and that embodiment of evil, and say, this far, you go no further. And not because the truth itself needs to be defended, the truth can defend itself, but because the real heroism comes in the fact that what you are defending are those people who cling to truth but don't have the ability to defend themselves in the same way that you do. That's a hero. That's the self-sacrificing pathos of a hero. This is part of the reason why I think that comic stories and a lot of franchise-type stories no longer have any meat to them. Why? Because they've proven time and again that death is off the table. And when death is off the table, then no, none of this is bravery. None of this is fortitude. You're not a hero. And by the way, this is why in my universe, when you're dead, you're dead. This is also the reason why there is no such thing as a quote-unquote progressive hero. Very few of these progressives are ready to die for their cause. They're ready to sacrifice the lives of others, multitudes of others, but never their own. And if you do meet someone who is ready to do that, tack on a good, healthy portion of suffering before they get there, and they're gone. And even if you do find one of these people who is enduring that suffering, how do they endure it? Well, they endure it by turning around to those innocents behind them and, instead of defending them, in turn inflict that pain and suffering upon them as payment for the progressive person having to endure it themselves. And what more, when that's not enough, they will dismantle the other bulwarks around truth to defend themselves. Because, as I said, at the heart of their progressive ideology is to get rid of any and all suffering, even to suffer the consequences of your own actions. And without that pathos, without that ability to suffer stalwartly the slings and arrows of this life through the realization that there is something greater than you, then if they're a character, they're a shallow character. And if they're a person, they're a shallow person. And if that person is a writer, he's going to write shallow stories. And so it doesn't matter if these people are on the page or standing in front of you. If they're not willing to bravely suffer through this life, then they have no character. And if they have no character, then heroism will never even touch their life. So, if I've given you anything new to think about, hit like, hit the shield in the lower right-hand corner of your screen to subscribe, and leave me a comment. Tell me what you think about all this. And don't forget, the links are in the description and on the pinned comment for my graphic novels, Crom the Destroyer, which is a return to form for low fantasy, and The Valiant Heroes and Thomas Valiant superhero graphic novels, where I give you a portrait of true heroic virtue. All right, I'll leave it there. I'll see you later.